It is the largest hand-cut stone building in North America, bigger than any cathedral, bigger than any fortress. It stretches nearly a quarter mile across the hills of Weston, West Virginia, with 2.5 miles of hallways hidden behind walls thick enough to swallow a scream. It was designed to hold 250 patients. At its peak, it held 10 times that number. And what happened inside those walls makes the building itself look like the least disturbing part of the story. Before this place ever became an asylum, it was the scene of a robbery. In 1858, the state of Virginia authorized construction of a massive new hospital for the mentally ill right along the West Fork River in what was then a quiet corner of Western Virginia. Workers broke ground using prison labor. Skilled stonemasons from Germany and Ireland were brought in to cut and lay thousands of blocks of blue sandstone, hauled from a quarry in nearby Mount Clair. The project was enormous, the budget was enormous, and the gold to pay for it sat in the vault of the Exchange Bank of Virginia, right in the center of town. Then the Civil War broke out. Virginia seceded from the Union, and the government in Richmond demanded the return of the hospital's unused construction funds to help finance the war effort. But before that could happen, Union soldiers got there first. At 5 a.m. on June 30th, 1861, the citizens of Weston were jolted awake by the sound of drums, fifes, and hundreds of marching boots entering their town. It was the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, led by Colonel Erastus Bernard Tyler, who had marched 25 miles through the night from Clarksburg. Tyler sent his troops sweeping through the streets to round up anyone suspected of Confederate sympathies. But that was not really why he was there. The real target was the Exchange Bank of Virginia on Center Avenue. Tyler dispatched an armed captain and 2 soldiers to the bank and ordered the banker, a man named Robert McClandish, to open the vault. Inside was roughly $27,000 in gold coins, worth over $500,000 today, all of it earmarked for the asylum's construction. McClandish tried to negotiate. He managed to keep about $2,000 that was already owed to creditors. The rest was seized at gunpoint and shipped north to Wheeling, where it became part of the treasury that helped establish a brand new state. West Virginia was born, in part, with money stolen from the construction fund of a lunatic asylum. To this day, some historians in the region call it a robbery, others call it a legal seizure. Either way, the gold was gone. The war was not done with the building. Confederate raiders swept through Weston multiple times, stealing supplies, food, and clothing that had been set aside for the hospital's first patients. The half-finished asylum was turned into a military camp. Union and Confederate troops took turns occupying the grounds. But when the war ended, the state made finishing the hospital a priority. And by the time the last stone was laid in 1881, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stood as one of the most ambitious buildings in America. Over 600 acres of land, its own farm, its own dairy, its own waterworks and cemetery. A 200-foot clock tower rose from the center of the structure, with clocks mounted on 3 of its 4 sides. Nobody knows why the 4th side was left blank. But this building was not supposed to be a place of suffering. It was designed by an architect named Richard Snowden Andrews, following a philosophy called the Kirkbride Plan. In the mid-1800s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Story Kirkbride looked at how America treated its mentally ill, locked in jails, chained in basements, forgotten in poorhouses, and decided there had to be a better way. His idea was revolutionary for the time. He believed the design of a building could actually help cure mental illness. Not drugs, not surgery, architecture. The plan called for wide hallways, tall ceilings, and an enormous number of windows. Trans-Allegheny had 921 windows, designed to flood every room with natural light. The wings of the building were arranged in a staggered formation, almost like outstretched arms, so that each section received its own supply of fresh air and sunlight. Every detail was deliberate. The 12-foot ceilings were meant to feel open, not confining. The grounds stretched across hundreds of acres so patients could walk freely outdoors. The hospital grew its own vegetables, kept its own dairy cows, and operated its own waterworks. Patients were given private rooms. They ate fresh food. They were treated not as prisoners, but as people who were simply unwell and deserving of care. In its earliest years, the asylum was everything Kirkbride had envisioned. One patient reportedly described the place as something closer to heaven than the kind of institution most people feared. That vision lasted about as long as the paint on the walls. The problem started almost immediately. Asylums in the 1800s were not just for the mentally ill. They were dumping grounds for anyone society did not know what to do with. Trans-Allegheny was no exception. People were committed for reasons that had nothing to do with mental illness. The actual hospital logbooks from 1864 to 1889 list the reasons patients were admitted: laziness, egotism, asthma, novel reading, disappointed love, bad whiskey, superstition, religious enthusiasm, imaginary female trouble, feebleness of intellect. Women were committed for going through menopause, for being insubordinate to their husbands, for using medicine to prevent pregnancy. Men could drop off their wives at the front door for almost any reason, including wanting to keep a mistress without the inconvenience of a wife at home. One woman was committed simply because her husband said she had been reading too many books and it was making her difficult. The asylum even offered payment to anyone who brought in a new patient, which created a financial incentive to lock people up. The more patients that came through the door, the more money someone pocketed. If you look at that list and think it sounds absurd, you are right. But here is the part that stops being funny. Once you were admitted, getting out was almost impossible. There was no process for appeal, no regular review, no one coming to check whether you actually belonged there. Many of these people, committed for things like reading too many novels or being sad after a breakup, spent the rest of their lives inside those walls. Some of them died there, and their families never came back. And when you fill a building with people who never should have been there in the first place, the system does not just bend, it breaks. By 1880, barely a year after construction was complete, the asylum already held 717 patients in a space designed for 250. By 1938, the population had climbed past 1,600. By the 1950s, it reached its peak. Over 2,400 people were crammed into a building where many of them were sleeping in shifts. 3 patients rotating through the same bed every 8 hours because there simply were not enough beds to go around. The staff were overwhelmed. At its worst, the ratio was 248 patients for every single doctor. Think about that. One doctor responsible for 248 people, many of them severely ill, many of them violent, many of them simply confused and terrified. Hallways that were supposed to bring light and air now reeked of human waste. Patients wandered the wards naked because there was not enough clothing, there was not enough furniture, not enough heat in the winter, not enough food. The beautiful sandstone walls that stonemasons had spent 23 years carving by hand were now coated in grime. A report published by the Charleston Gazette in 1949 described conditions inside the asylum as looking like a hog pen and smelling even worse. One wing that had been renovated by the Works Progress Administration during the Depression was considered livable. The rest of the building was a nightmare. Patients were left to fend for themselves in darkness, in cold, in filth. And when thousands of desperate, frightened, confused people are packed into a space with almost no supervision, violence becomes inevitable. Fires broke out. Patients attacked other patients. One night, a 12-year-old boy convinced an older, mentally impaired patient to help him kill another man. They tried to hang him with bed sheets. When that did not work, they put the metal leg of a bed frame against his skull and jumped on the bed until the leg crushed through. Female staff members were assaulted repeatedly. And then there was the nurse. One evening, a nurse simply vanished. No one saw her leave. No one found a note. She was just gone. Her body was discovered 2 months later, decomposing at the bottom of an unused stairwell. No one was ever charged. But as horrifying as the overcrowding and the violence were, the state of West Virginia was about to make things much worse. In 1952, a man drove up to the asylum in a van. He had no formal surgical training. He charged $25 per patient, and he called his procedure a cure. His name was Dr. Walter Freeman, and he was the most famous lobotomist in America. Freeman had spent years promoting a procedure he called the transorbital lobotomy. The idea was simple, and the execution was brutal. He would take a thin metal instrument shaped like an ice pick, slide it under the patient's eyelid, tap it through the thin bone of the eye socket with a small mallet, and push it into the brain. Then he would sweep the instrument back and forth, severing the connections in the front of the brain. The entire procedure took about 10 minutes. Freeman did not use anesthesia. Instead, he used electroshock to knock the patient unconscious before he started. Sometimes. Other times he did not bother. He performed these surgeries in front of audiences. Crowds of doctors and staff would gather to watch, as if it were a medical demonstration. Freeman treated it like a performance. West Virginia was desperate. The asylums were overflowing, and the state had no money to build new facilities or hire more staff. So when Freeman offered his services as part of what he called the West Virginia Lobotomy Project, the state said yes. Over a 12-day stretch in the summer of 1952, Freeman performed 228 lobotomies across 4 state hospitals, averaging 8 surgeries per day. On one single day, he lobotomized 25 women back-to-back, spending less than 10 minutes on each one. He moved through the wards like a factory line. Patients were wheeled in, shocked unconscious, operated on, and wheeled out. Many of them never consented to the procedure. Their families signed for them, or the hospital staff made the decision. Some patients did not even know what had been done to them until they woke up and realized something fundamental about who they were had been erased. But the worst part was not the procedure itself. It was who Freeman targeted and how he talked about it. At Lakin State Hospital, a segregated facility for black patients, Freeman lobotomized 20 black men he described in his own notes as 20 very dangerous individuals. A week later, he returned and found them sitting quietly under the trees with only one guard in sight. He recorded this as a success. He bragged about it. The lobotomy had not cured them. It had destroyed them, and Freeman called it progress. By 1955, nearly 900 people across West Virginia had been lobotomized. 4 patients died during the procedures from brain hemorrhages when Freeman's instrument severed a blood vessel. Many more were left unable to care for themselves, unable to speak clearly, unable to recognize their own families. About 1 in 4 became what Freeman himself described as a domestic invalid, alive but hollow, requiring constant care for the rest of their lives. They shuffled through the hallways of the asylum like ghosts. They stared at walls. If you spoke to them, they might respond with a word or two, but the person they had been was gone. The introduction of a drug called Thorazine in the mid-1950s finally made the ice pick obsolete. Thorazine could sedate patients chemically without cutting into their brains. Doctors called it the chemical lobotomy, which tells you something about what it did. But at least it left the brain intact. The lobotomy program in West Virginia ended. Freeman himself kept performing the procedure at other facilities around the country until 1967, when a patient died on his operating table during a live demonstration, and he was finally banned from practicing. If you have ever wondered what really happened inside America's abandoned asylums, you are in the right place. Subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next story we uncover. But even after the lobotomies stopped, the asylum was far from finished, destroying people. It took decades for the outside world to fully grasp what had been happening behind those 2.5-foot thick stone walls. The Charleston Gazette, the same newspaper that had called the asylum a hog pen in 1949, came back in 1985 and found that almost nothing had changed. Court-appointed inspectors reported that patients were still living in filth. Many were naked. Bathrooms were smeared with feces. The building was described as dirty and unkempt, which barely captures what the inspectors actually found. By the 1980s, the patient population had dropped as new medications and community treatment programs slowly replaced long-term institutionalization. But for the patients who remained, the ones deemed too difficult or too damaged to release into the outside world, conditions were no better. Some were locked in cages, not rooms, not cells, metal cages like animals, because the staff had no other way to manage them. In 1986, Governor Arch Moore announced plans to close the hospital and build a new facility nearby. The remaining patients were gradually transferred to the William R. Sharp Jr. Hospital across town. The asylum limped along for 8 more years. When the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum finally closed its doors in May of 1994, it had been in operation for 130 years. 130 years of admissions for laziness and disappointed love. 130 years of overcrowding and understaffing. 130 years of ice baths and electroshock and ice picks through the eye socket. No one knows exactly how many people died inside. Official records are incomplete. The hospital kept inconsistent documentation for decades, and some records were lost or destroyed. But the historian Titus Swan, who has spent years combing through thousands of pages of hospital records and state archives, estimates the number is in the 5 figures. Tens of thousands of people, many of whom should never have been committed in the first place, entered this building and never left. The building that helped create a state had finally run out of lives to ruin. It sat empty for over a decade, its windows shattered, its hallways slowly filling with debris and decay. Rain seeped through the roof. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The farm was abandoned, the dairy was shuttered. The cemetery on the hillside grew over with weeds and was forgotten. Then, in 2007, the state put it up for auction. The winning bidder was Joe Jordan, an asbestos demolition contractor from Morgantown, who paid $1.5 million for the entire 242,000 square foot complex. Bidding had started at $500,000. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is a tourist attraction. You can take a 90-minute history tour during the day, or an overnight ghost hunt when the sun goes down. Television crews from Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures have filmed inside its crumbling wards, searching for spirits with thermal cameras and audio recorders. Every October, part of the building is converted into a haunted house, where actors jump out of the same rooms where real patients once sat in their own filth, waiting for help that never came. But the strangest part of visiting is not the ghosts people come looking for. It is what the building has preserved. Visitors pay to walk the same hallways where patients once slept in shifts, where a nurse was left to decompose for 2 months, where a man with an ice pick destroyed 900 brains and called it medicine. The museum on the first floor displays patient artwork, old restraints, and a real straitjacket behind glass. The building still stands. The clock tower still rises 200 feet above the town of Weston. The clocks still mark the time on 3 of its 4 faces. And if you walk far enough past the main building, down a steep path at the edge of the property, you will find a quiet hillside. It looks peaceful, just grass and trees and silence. But beneath that grass are the graves of patients who were buried with numbers instead of names. No headstones, no dates, no one left to remember who they were. If this story stays with you, leave a comment and tell us which asylum we should investigate next. Like this video and subscribe to Ward Files. There are hundreds of these places across America. Most of their stories have never been told.